All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. I hope you're in the right session because I am now. This is going to be the Azure Security Storage session. This is actually based off of a document. This document is Best Practices by Microsoft. It is over 700 pages long. I skimmed it for you so you don't have to. If you want any of the links throughout this entire presentation, they're going to be on this one QR code, or if you don't like QR codes, there's a link that you can type. This is a link that I create. It's called a link tree. If you're on social media, you already know what that is. If you're not, it's this place where you get to put all of the links and you organize them so people can go click on resources that you want to share. This has my socials. This has all of the links from within the presentations and links to demos from certain parts of the presentation if you want those for later. And again, if you want that link, it is here. But an introduction of myself. My name is Karinne Bessette, and I am a technologist with Veeam Software. I do agnostic presentations like this out in the community. I have tons of certifications. I might have a problem, but I think it's a good problem. But I do like other things. I have my fur babies. I like all kinds of gaming, whether you're talking about PC gaming or board top gaming. I made my own roll tower just because I thought 3D printing was fun, and I was going to show up to my game night with a really cool custom-made tower with light-up dice, of course. So going into the security presentation itself, feel free if you have any questions as we go along. I'm happy to dive deeper into any of these topics. This is going to be a high-level overview with probably a little bit of buffer at the end for you to ask questions as well. We'll cover fluency in terms, because not only does Microsoft like to rename things, they like to rename things in ways that make it impossible to understand what you're looking for, or it's too similar. But knowing some of these terminologies can help you find the right documentation. And then planning for success, some of the tools that I use, and I will attempt to do a demo for you guys of just configuring a storage account, going over some of the settings, and then some of the features that you can do in your environment. Now expect your plan never actually meets your reality. You're going to have credential problems, regulation problems, all kinds of changes that happen in Microsoft. And we used to joke about like Patch Tuesday. Well, Patch Tuesday isn't a thing anymore. That's every single day with the Azure and Microsoft 365 backend. First of all, when it comes to storage, you have a couple different storage types. These are all made underneath of what's called a storage account. So you have Blob, which 90% of what you're using in Azure Storage is probably going to be centric around Blob, especially if you're using a third-party software to access it. I happen to work for Veeam Software, and we use it as a backup repository space. Cool things about Blob is Blob actually works on a file block system that saves you more storage than any file type system out there, not just including Azure Blob, but anything that's S3 compatible or AWS. Then you have File. File is going to be the answer to the conversation, how do I get it on my computer as a shared drive so that my users that are used to clicking on shared drives can see it as a shared drive? That's going to be your file. Queue is only going to be really necessary if you're doing anything with databases. This makes sure it's a first in, first out scenario, no matter how much data you're throwing at that database at the same time. This is the first tip in the series of tips that I hope you can take away. Generally speaking, we want to have a production environment and then a development environment. These are going to be two separate accounts. In order to visually see the difference, you can actually change the appearance within your portal. And I recommend having a difference between these environments because you will in fact misconfigure the wrong environment if you're not visually looking at these in different accounts, even if you're using different profiles on browsers. I might have about 15 on both Brave and Chrome. And many ways to multi-factor. Now, multi-factor authentication has been really a hot topic, and everyone thinks you need to have multi-factor authentication because this is true when it's possible. Something like a school system, and just out of curiosity, any of you in a school system? Well, could you imagine trying to make all of your students do multi-factor authentication? They don't have devices. So thinking of creative ways around these situations and how to access these storage types, multi-factor authentication is great whenever possible, and you can have things like tokens or USBs versus having phones. Those considerations for your demographic. Naming storage. Now, who's actually made a storage account before inside of Azure? So whenever you make a storage account, you start typing, and about 6 times in typing it, it's like, you can't make this, you can't use that character, can't use XYZ. But it also has to be unique. Being able to recognize a storage account, create a unique storage account naming convention, and still removing all of these special characters, it can get a little hard to read. So helping to create a system, and this is something that was posted on one of our partners, which is Check Your Logs. They came up with ideas for naming conventions. You want to think of 3 to 4 characters that are going to be your start. This way you always have something unique, then you can continue. Possibly then putting which region that is within, because cross-region traffic costs money. And if you don't want to worry about ingress-egress cost, even on the Azure backbone, it's still going to cost if you choose different regions for your storage to transfer data between those regions, unless you have a storage gateway. Then if you're looking at what it's being used for, is it development, or are you having a on-site storage access, whatever it might be. These are kind of like the nest eggs to creating a good naming convention, and do it at the early start and make everyone follow the same naming convention. There are certain kinds of protocols that you can put into your environment, like policies. Policies can be enforced that you have to have these certain policies in order to deploy the storage account. Choosing your region wisely. Now, if you start scrolling through the storage browser and clicking the different regions across the states, across Africa, across anywhere in the world, you're going to notice that they're going to each cost different. Now, you also have to consider, well, data sovereignty is going to be a factor, whether or not you have to transfer data from on-premises to there's going to be a longer latency. And then the cost between those regions, if your applications sit in the primary Americas region, but you're using somewhere in, say, Zambia, because electric's cheap, everything's cheap, storage is cheap, you're going to cost a lot in ingress and egress for those protocols between the regions. So keeping those in mind. Also, not all regions have all files and features available across the board. Some of them are disabled. And there's a link, again, on that link tree that you're able to look at what is available in what region. Something my good friend Jim here in the audience likes to point out is there is immutability and there is indelibility. These are 2 different features. Indelibility is something that is on your on-premises environment where you've locked it down so that no one can access it, no one can remove data, sort of. But you can still kind of erase it from the paper if you really try. Immutability is how we think of worm tape way back, where you can only write once, read many. And object storage with object lock is the new age kind of version of this. Azure was a little behind the story when it came to Azure Blob. They had something that was called a container level immutability, which means I put everything in this container and nothing can be removed from this container if any one new object is added to this container, which gets really big and really bloated. Recently, in the last year or so, they've added something called file level immutability onto the storage of those blobs, so you can actually tier out older files within that same without having to create a new container or create all this data and keep it forever and always. If you're in some type of law situation and you keep all that data, you would have had to hand all of that data over if you haven't sunset it. Now, lifecycle management is something that you'll create on the storage account level. And what this is soft delete policies and the place that you can configure the file level immutability right here. And we'll create a storage account so we can take a look at some of these settings. And tags. One of my favorite things is making and enforcing tags in the environment, because tags can be used to terminate processes, stop processes from even being created, and for expense tracking. So if you need to say, hey, why do we have this huge storage bill? And you've ever been to the Cost Explorer, it's this pie graph that shows you the 4 top storage. And then you have to keep digging. If you create tags, you can organize that Storage Explorer by those tags and say, hey, show me which tag is using the most amount of data. And you find out, okay, for some reason, finance uploaded their entire video archive of all their parties they've ever had. Why? I have no idea. But now I know and I can address this issue. This is some of the examples of tags that I have in my personal environment. I do apply generally good tags. So I have the storage, what the storage is used for, it's a demo. The access level, which is public. Then there's a retention info type, which is a very weird tag that got placed automatically to this machine. And then the owner, which is myself. So those are some examples of different tags that you can add to those machines. And again, enforcing them with something called tag policies or any type of policies, something that means you cannot create a resource unless you apply a tag to it. Now, storage accounts. Whenever you're looking at a container, a file, a queue, these are all going to conglomerately be under what's called a storage account. This storage account, then you apply some type of access control to. So however you access that is the authority through the Azure portal, or if you have storage keys. It used to be called Azure AD authentication, which is technically the preferred method, but is now Entra ID authentication. This allows you to do something like, okay, everyone with XYZ role has read-write access to this data source. Generally speaking, this is going to grow with you, but it's going to have the most amount of configuration on the front end. The keys are the alternative way to be able to access this. Now, keys, you're going to have 2 keys, and you can rotate those keys and say, I configure everything in my environment with key 1. Key 1 gets compromised, rip and replace key 2. That's kind of a pain. But if you have something with the AD side, you can just configure, change access controls, and drop anything you don't want. Alternatively, you can configure additional roles with the shared access signatures. Shared access signatures allow you to say, okay, from this time to this time, this person has this access, and only read. And again, we'll take a look at that and configure it inside the portal for you. Now, whenever you create a SaaS, which is the shared access key, you get an account, a service, or a user type to be able to grant those privileges. Depending if it's a blob versus a file storage, you're going to have different kinds of rights that you're allowed to assign to those different users. In this case, if you have a user, that's only for blob. So if you're doing user role access, which is kind of like having temporary employees come in, they're supposed to access it during certain times, you don't want them off hours, this might be something that you use as a temporary rip and replace. And these are going to be backed by those access keys. So access key 1 and 2, you rip and replace one of those, all of those users are going to lose access. Any questions about that before we take a look at it? Okay. Let's see here. So inside the Azure portal, I have a couple different things pulled up, but we're just going to go straight into the storage accounts and create a brand new shiny storage account, hopefully. And we'll have to come up with a new name. And here I have different resource groups. Think of resource groups as management groups. If you delete a resource group, you will delete everything under that resource group. So you may do it by project or based off of service. In this case, in my environment, I have a storage resource group that If I need to nuke all my storage, I click delete resource group storage, and all of a sudden my bill is a lot happier for my expense report. Here we'll do secure West Virginia, and we'll have to do 2 because I've already made a 1 for this practice. Here's that regional side that we were talking about. Now, all of these regions are going to have different associated costs and different data sovereignty rules, so you want to be mindful of that. And not all regions are going to be able to do globally redundant or geo-redundant or other types of redundancies. So that's something else for fault zones you'll have to worry about. Standard and premium. Unless you are doing something on a database size, you probably don't need the premium tier here. You will just need the standard tier. The more layers or protection that you have here, the more the storage is going to cost. Most of the time in a lab environment, I'll do locally redundant. That does mean if power goes out at a data center or a data center gets nuked, you are no longer going to have access to your data. If you do geo-redundant, that means East US and East US 2 are both going to have your data source so that you can fail over to that probably in sync second side. Next is the advanced tier. If you do have some type of software that's going to be connecting to this data source, you have the RESTful API. If you do not, I would recommend disabling the RESTful API access unless you know that's going to be something that you need. Whether or not you want to even allow for storage access keys and the tokens that are associated with that. If you do deploy an Entra ID environment and you have all those shared access controls and roles, you don't need to have that, and you don't want an admin coming in and creating a vulnerability in your environment. You can immediately disconnect that from here. We'll be taking a look at that in demo, so I'm going to leave that on here for now. And then we have versions. If you're using anything below 1.2 for any reason, I recommend figuring out what that reason is and terminate using anything below 1.2 for your TLS. Then we have this hot cold. Something very interesting, there's not a lot of settings that you can change post inside of creating a storage account, but this is one of them. If you're going to have lower access to this storage and you don't need to have everything being pulled in and pulled out all the time, but there might be a scenario that you need to fastly pull out data, you can leave it in a cold tier and then hot switch it to a hot tier whenever you need that data, pull it all out, and no one's going to complain. You will pay for the storage at a hot tier cost for that time, but you can hot swap these back and forth, which is really cool. And we'll take a look at this. Networking. By default, everything is on everyone can access the storage from anywhere in the world. This is probably not the way that you want to be able to access the storage for all times. If you have remote workers, I would even recommend having them have to connect to a VPN to then get to these files and allow the only public access point from your on-premises environment at whatever data center that you're working with. That would probably be the most secure way to lock it down if you don't have everyone in the same office. We'll leave it there for now because I've also locked myself out of my storage before because my ISP decided to reset my public IP address in the middle of one of my demos once. It was a great time. Here is the data protection that we were talking about earlier. Data protection allows you to set thresholds for soft delete of the entire container, the blobs, the file shares, all granularly. So if you're going to be having a longer retention on each one of these, you can put that here. And if you want to be able to use the immutable file type, that's actually under the access control here. I want to be able to delete this after we're done, so I'm going to leave that one alone for now. Fun story about immutability is my company decided we're going to do immutability for our backups and allows anyone to configure that within the backup process. I manage our lab environment for my team, and all of them wanted to test out this nice new shiny feature. So they did. And then they asked me, how do I delete this? Because I'm done testing this, and they backed up terabytes of data for 3 to 4 years. And I'm like, well, we kind of don't. We're just going to have to live with this for now. And I terminated the account to, tear off after that amount of time. Be mindful whenever you're doing immutability. It really is immutable unless you want to go through a bunch of hoops, contact Microsoft with your entire purchase history, your owner accounts, signs off, NDA, whatever, in order to get this deleted. You cannot remove it. Encryption, you have a couple different options. If you do not have your own encryption key on-prem and you don't want to bring your own encryption key, going with the MMK is completely fine. You're probably not using your own managed encryption key unless you're government. That's the only time I've really seen that used very often. Tags. You can add any kind of tag you want here. This case, I won't make you read through all of it while I sit here and create. And now here's where the magic happens. So when you're watching a cooking show and they start making everything and then all of a sudden they're like, hey, we pulled it out of the oven. Well, that's kind of what I'm going to do here. We're going to pull it out of the oven because I made one just a couple of minutes ago so that you didn't have to wait for all of that creation. Inside of creating any type of object storage or file storage, you're going to start on this overview tab. This is the storage account. Then you can scroll down and you have to add either a container or a file share, which I've added two in here. If you want to give access with any of those shared access keys, so these are the two access keys that we were referring to where you can sunset them by rotating the keys here, are used inside of the shared access keys here. So whenever you scroll down, you can see whether or not you're going to use key 1 or key 2. Then assigning to either key 1 or key 2, you can decide, okay, is it a service, container, or object? And then which objects are associated or they're going to have access. So if you just want a file account or file share they're going to have access to, you can uncheck everything except for that file. And it'll automatically uncheck boxes that do not apply when you do that. Then you can say, I only want during certain times under certain IP addresses. So this gets very granular and you can make sure it's only HTTPS only. Now you have a different type of access when you come up to containers. So I created a container here. It also has its own rules of funny naming convention, but these do not have to be unique to the entire Microsoft 365 environment. You have your access policies, which can be created for immutable storage, whether or not you want to enforce immutable storage. If you did not check that box to enable immutability when you first started creating the storage account, you cannot go back and change that later. You actually have to create a new storage account in order to enable this immutability. You also have access tokens. These access tokens would probably be used in something like a software or development side that you've been used to connect to the back end. And again, these are going to use that key 1 and key 2 side. Inside of creating a file share, you have a couple more options that you don't have inside of the containers that make it easier to manage from the front end to the back end. And you have your access control through IAMs. So this would be configuring your Entra ID side, having an access for a specific group to the storage can be done this way. But one of my favorite features is this right here. When you hit connect, you can actually generate automatically a drive letter, how it's being accessed via Active Directory, which this hasn't been updated yet, but you can expect this is going to become Entra ID directory rather than Active Directory and then storage keys. Then you can tell it to show script. So you can copy this into your environment and deploy it as a policy on Windows so everyone has a Z drive that is your shared drive automatically. And it comes to this file. Any questions about the creation? Cool. We'll hop back in. This is more on the storage access keys in your environment. Again, the link to this documentation is on that single QR code. And we just created that. Now for monitoring. Who believes security involves monitoring? Monitoring is security. Thank you. All right. So there's a couple different ways that you can monitor inside the Azure environment. You have the Azure Security Center, which will give you like baselines. You also have Advisor. If you want to pay for it, you also have Microsoft Defender or Microsoft 365 Defender, depending on which way that you're accessing this and how it's being deployed. In some cases, if you have machines and you want to use Defender around in different environments, like your virtual machines will need a plugin that you attach to it. Otherwise, you also have Azure Firewall and Sentinel. Who's gotten to play with Sentinel? Did it cost a lot when you played with it? Okay, so Azure Sentinel is really, really cool. It's a place that will ingest logs from multiple locations, including non-Microsoft resources. So this could be Azure, this could be your on-premises environment, this could be your machines in Google, whatever it might be. What it does is it aggregates all of the logs to a single place, and then it runs their backend AI onto all of these logs that is pulled in. So it could say, okay, your individual monitoring systems, not unusual, not unusual, not unusual traffic. But this will say, you know what, I've seen it 10 times before, but this happening here, and this happening here is a known attack, and you are under attack right now, and it's about to get really bad if you do not terminate whatever stream or process that's happening. And it'll even run playbooks if you let it run stuff automatically. It's a really scary, cool SIM, but I do recommend if you're going to use it, turn it on for an hour and turn it off. The reason is it will generate a ton of logs, a ton of data that needs to be consumed, and then you'll know how long it's going to take you to run all of that time. So a little bit more on Azure Advisor. I like Azure Advisor because it gives you that pretty frontline dashboard where some top things that you can go take a look at. A lot of us are not frontline cloud administrators. I myself is a mini hat type of person, so knowing everything that I can and cannot configure inside this environment is entirely impossible. This will also give you ideas and tips if you have to follow different regulations. You can say, hey, what regulation do I have to follow if I'm HIPAA compliant? It'll tell you. So it's a good place to show your performance, whether or not you're meeting that. It does have some cost metrics. The cost metrics do still link back to the cost portal, which you're going to get more detail from there. They have quick fixes inside of here. So in this case, it had shut down unauthorized access to different machines or have the right size machine. If you're not consuming space all the time, you're not consuming processing power, but you're paying for maybe one of the B16 machines. It's not a terribly large machine, but when you could be using a B4 machine, you could save tons of money by downgrading that machine if it lets you. This is showing off the score. The score is, I think, subjective. Not everything applies to everyone's environment, but it's definitely a good place to go and look if you're not sure where to start. There's automated storage accounts, alerts that you can configure. If you want to say monitoring if anything more than 10 gigs comes out of a storage account in an hour. Putting data in probably happens all the time, but when you start having a lot of exfiltration of data, you might want an alert on that. You can do it from an SMS, you can do a webhook, you can do an email address, whatever you want to offer that threshold. And then checking your email. So this is an email that came into my manager's email box, and all of a sudden his account started deploying a bunch of machines. And if he hadn't been monitoring just his email account inside of our lab environment, we would have suddenly seen, okay, someone's made some money doing some cryptocurrency exchanges on here. So monitoring your email and not just sending these to junk mail is a really good idea. Now some take-homes. Who's seen the Azure Storage Explorer? It's actually one of my favorite tools to have on my machine here, because being an admin is not my day job, but I can quickly come in here, take a look at all of these storage accounts underneath of my name. I can right click on side of here and automatically create a storage access key. So if I want someone to have immediate access on the fly, You can add in multiple organizations to the same place. This can be your one-stop shop if you're not 100% sold on having everything inside of your browser window. I'm a little torn both ways on that. This is the tip for being able to change the tier. You can actually hot change stuff from hot to cold. That is one of the few settings you can change after. This is the link to different services that are available in different regions. And if you want more information and you're not sure like if there's more groups like this, one of the groups out there is actually the Microsoft Teams group. Most states in the United States actually have this. I speak at one of my local groups fairly often about Microsoft 365, but they'll also have MVPs there that can usually tell you kind of hint if something's coming or if you need to be concerned about something or just quick ask questions. Even if their specialty is not on the specific topic you're talking about, they may know the other MVP and be able to get you an inside contact. And that's what I had for you today. Any questions? Fantastic. Huh?
I would like the links again.
Sure. Let's see here. It's going to make me exit first. Become a fan of this one link rules it all because you don't have to pause on slides to let people wait for the phones to go down. But this is a link, and if you're not a fan of QR code, that's why I also did type it up there if you want to type it in and take a picture with you. But thank you all for joining me.